Picture this. It's September 1940, and you're looking up at the skies over London during the height of the Blitz. German aircraft are swarming in, trying to crush the RAF and clear the way for an invasion. The city's survival? Well, it pretty much hinged on its defenses, especially the hundreds of anti-aircraft guns pointed at the sky. But there was a massive hidden problem.
See that number? 1,800. During the Blitz, that's how many shells, on average, anti-aircraft crews were firing for every single enemy plane they shot down. And honestly, most experts think the real number was probably way, way higher. The guns were basically just making a lot of noise. They were a deterrent, sure, but they weren't a truly effective weapon.
So that's the big question we're digging into. Why was it so unbelievably hard to hit a plane flying miles above your head? And what secret invention, developed right in the middle of the war, would completely change the battlefield forever? Let's find out.
Okay, so to really understand the solution, you first have to appreciate just how immense the problem was. Hitting a tiny, fast-moving plane miles away? Yeah, it's not as simple as just pointing and shooting. It's more like a really, really high-stakes guessing game.
Think of it like this. Every single shot was a duel. On the ground, you have the gunner trying to predict the plane's altitude, its speed, its direction, all so they can aim at where the plane is going to be. But up in the air, the pilot's entire job is to be unpredictable, zigging and zagging, randomly changing all three of those things to make that prediction impossible. It was a complete shot in the dark.
And if that wasn't hard enough, there's another layer to this. Before you even fire, the crew had to do some quick math in the middle of an air raid, figure out how long the shell would take to get up there, and then manually set a little mechanical timer on the shell itself. If you were off by even a fraction of a second, the shell would just explode in an empty patch of sky. Totally useless.
The obvious solution, then, was to build a smart shell, one that could find its own target and detonate at just the right moment. But in the 1940s, that was pure science fiction. The problem wasn't the idea. It was the brutal, violent physics of being fired out of a cannon.
So check this out. Any electronics you put inside that shell had to survive an acceleration of 20,000 Gs. That's 20,000 times the force of gravity. It's one of those numbers that's so big it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around it.
So let's try to make that real. At 20,000 Gs, something that weighs just 1 gram, think less than a paperclip, momentarily weighs 20 kilograms, or about 44 pounds. Now imagine trying to build a delicate little radio transmitter where every tiny component suddenly weighs 20,000 times more than it should. Yeah, good luck with that.
And that's why this was pretty much seen as an unsolvable problem. I mean, both Britain and Germany had looked into radar-triggered fuses before the war and just gave up. They decided it was impossible. The vacuum tubes they had back then were just way too big and way too fragile. There was just no way to make them small enough and tough enough to survive the launch. But the Americans kept at it. They were getting hammered by aerial attacks on their ships in the Pacific, and they desperately needed a solution. So they developed what was arguably one of the most important inventions of the war, the VT, or Variable Time Fuse. It was basically a miniature self-contained radar set that could fit right into the nose of an artillery shell. And the genius of this thing started with just powering it on. See, you couldn't just use a normal battery, so they came up with this incredible Rube Goldberg-like system. When the shell gets fired, it starts spinning like crazy. That spinning force pulls out a couple of safety levers. That releases a plunger, which smashes a tiny glass vial of liquid electrolyte. The liquid floods the battery, and that powers up the whole system, but only after it's safely flying through the air. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, so it's powered on. How does it see? Well, it used the Doppler effect. The fuse sent out a continuous radio wave. As the shell got closer to a plane, that wave would bounce back at a slightly higher frequency. The fuse would then measure the difference between the signal it sent out and the one that came back. That difference created a new, low-frequency signal called a beat note. The closer the shell got, the stronger that beat note became. And the final piece of this amazing puzzle was a special high-speed switch called a thyrotron. When that beat note signal got strong enough, which meant the shell was at the perfect distance to do maximum damage, it triggered the thyrotron, completed the circuit, and boom, the shell detonated into a massive cloud of shrapnel. So, this incredibly clever device actually worked. But what did that really mean for the war? Well, its impact can't be overstated. It was nothing short of a revolution. The difference was just staggering. Remember that 1,800 rounds per kill number? Well, with a VT fuse, it plummeted down to about 100. That is a nearly 20-fold increase in effectiveness literally overnight. Suddenly, anti-aircraft guns weren't just for scaring pilots anymore, they were incredibly deadly weapons.
To put that in perspective, a jump in lethality that massive is historically compared to the introduction of the machine gun in World War I. It fundamentally changed the rules of engagement for both air and even ground warfare.
And this fuse was deployed at critical moments all across the globe. It first saw action in the Pacific in early '43, turning the tide against Japanese air attacks. It was then approved for use over land to counter the V-1 buzz bomb assault on Britain. And finally, it was a decisive factor in the Battle of the Bulge.
This thing was vital. It was the #1 defense against waves of kamikaze attacks, saving countless ships. It was responsible for downing up to 80% of the V-1 rockets aimed at London. And in the Battle of the Bulge, it allowed artillery to be used in a whole new way, detonating shells in the air above the forest canopy, raining shrapnel down on German troops who thought they were completely safe.
So when you have a weapon this effective, your next biggest challenge is keeping it a secret. Because if the Axis powers captured one and reverse-engineered it, that huge advantage would be lost.
So they went to extraordinary lengths to protect it. At first, the fuse was only authorized for use over the ocean, so any unexploded shells would just be lost to the sea. Its components were built in different factories, so no single group of workers knew exactly what they were making. And they tracked every single fuse, even sending officers out into the snow during the Battle of the Bulge just to recover any duds.
You know, while the atomic bomb ended the war with a terrifying exclamation point, a lot of historians argue the VT fuse was the invention that truly changed the narrative. It was the counter to the airplane, the weapon that shifted the balance of power back to the defenders on sea and on land, and it enabled victories that might have otherwise been impossible.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? We often focus on the most famous moments and technologies in history. But what other stories, like the one of the humble VT fuse, are just hidden in plain sight, waiting to completely change our understanding of the past?